Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Golden Years. James Escobar stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the Manhattan skyline glitter in the late afternoon sun. At 38, he commanded one of the most successful investment portfolios on Wall Street, managing over $2 billion for Ross Capital Management. His track record was flawless, 15 years without a single losing quarter. Mr. Escobar, his assistant, Joyce Maxwell, appeared at the doorway. The quarterly reports are ready for your review. James turned from the window, his sharp gray eyes scanning the documents. The numbers told the same story they had for years: exponential growth, satisfied clients, and profits that made Ernest Ross one of the wealthiest men in New York. Under James's management, the firm had grown from a modest $50 million operation to a financial powerhouse. Joyce, schedule the client presentations for next week. Make sure Ernest and John are both available. James had learned early in his career that transparency bred trust, and trust bred loyalty. Every quarter, he personally presented results to their top-tier clients, explaining not just what happened, but why. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd met his wife, Angelica, at one of these very presentations 7 years ago. She'd been fresh out of Harvard Business School, working as an analyst for a pension fund. Her questions were sharp, her insights astute, and her smile had completely derailed his usually flawless presentation. They'd married 2 years later, and Ernest Ross had gained not just a daughter-in-law, but the most talented portfolio manager on the East Coast. "James, you in there?" The gruff voice of Ernest Ross echoed from the outer office. At 65, Ernest was a bear of a man with silver hair and a permanent scowl. He built Ross Capital from nothing, starting as a small-time broker in Brooklyn before moving to Manhattan in the 80s. "Always working, Dad," James replied, using the term Ernest had insisted upon since the wedding. It had never felt natural. Ernest's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Good. The Ross family doesn't raise quitters." He stepped into the office, closing the door behind him, an unusual gesture that immediately put James on alert. "Is everything all right?" "The third quarter numbers are exceptional. We're tracking for our best year yet." "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss." Ernest settled into the leather chair across from James's desk. 15 years is a hell of a run, son. You've made a lot of people very wealthy." Something in Ernest's tone made James's instincts prickle. In 15 years of working together, Ernest had never been one for small talk or sentiment. "I appreciate that, but I hope you're not thinking about retirement. We're just hitting our stride." Ernest's laugh was dry, humorless. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. But I've been thinking about succession planning. John's finally ready to step up." John Ross was Ernest's son from his first marriage, a 32-year-old Harvard MBA who'd spent the last 5 years bouncing between different departments at Ross Capital. He was competent enough, but lacked the instinctive understanding of markets that separated good managers from great ones. "John's talented," James said carefully. "What role were you thinking?" "Your role." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. James felt his world tilt slightly, but his expression remained neutral, a skill learned from years of high-stakes negotiations. "I'm sorry. John will be taking over as Chief Investment Officer. It's time for fresh blood, new perspectives. The financial world is changing, and we need someone who understands the younger generation of investors." James's mind raced through the implications. 15 years of building relationships, developing strategies, nurturing client trust, all to be handed over to someone who'd never managed anything larger than a $10 million test portfolio. "Ernest, with respect, our clients trust me. They've invested based on my track record. A transition like this could spook them. They trust the Ross name," Ernest corrected, his voice hardening. "You've done well, James, but let's not forget who gave you this opportunity. John is family. Blood is thicker than water." The phrase hit James like a slap. Despite 7 years of marriage to Angelica, despite the successful partnership, despite treating Ernest like a father, he was still an outsider. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you." John takes over Monday morning. You'll stay on for 2 weeks to facilitate the transition, then we'll find you something else. Maybe a smaller portfolio to start. James felt a cold fury building in his chest, but his voice remained steady. And Angelica? Does she know about this? She'll understand. Family comes first in the Ross household. James stood slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the seated Ernest. I see. And my clients? The pension funds, the endowments, the private investors who specifically requested to work with me. They're Ross Capital clients, not James Escobar clients. Don't get too big for your britches, son. The dismissive tone was the final insult. James had sacrificed everything for this company. 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, postponed vacations with Angelica. He'd turned down lucrative offers from competitors because he believed in loyalty, in building something lasting. I'll need to review my contract, James said quietly. Ernest's smile was predatory. Already taken care of. Legal says the succession clause gives me full discretion over portfolio assignments. Your non-compete is ironclad. 2 years. No financial services work in New York. It was then that James realized this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a calculated move, planned and executed with the precision of a hostile takeover. Ernest had been planning this for months, maybe years. I understand, James said finally. Good. I knew you'd be reasonable. Ernest stood, straightening his jacket. Family dinner Sunday night. Angelica's making that lasagna you like. We'll celebrate John's promotion then. As Ernest left the office, James remained standing at his desk, staring at the quarterly reports that would be his last. But instead of devastation, he felt something else entirely. A cold, calculating anger that reminded him exactly why he'd been so successful for so long. Ernest Ross had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Chapter 2, The Announcement. Sunday dinner at the Ross family estate in the Hamptons had always been a command performance. The sprawling Tudor mansion sat on 15 acres overlooking the Atlantic, a monument to old money and older grudges. James arrived with Angelica in their Tesla, the electric hum a stark contrast to the rumbling engines of the vintage Bentleys and Mercedes that filled the circular driveway. You've been quiet all weekend, Angelica observed as they walked up the stone steps. At 31, she had inherited her father's sharp business mind, but tempered it with a warmth that had been conspicuously absent from the Ross DNA for generations. Everything okay at work? James squeezed her hand. Just tired. Big week ahead. The lie felt necessary. Angelica's relationship with her father was complicated, equal parts love and exasperation. Ernest had never quite forgiven her for marrying outside the established social circle, despite James's obvious success. Adding family drama to that mix seemed cruel. James, there's my golden boy. John Ross's voice boomed across the marble foyer. He was already 3 drinks into what would undoubtedly be a long evening, his Harvard class ring catching the light as he gestured expansively. Dad told me the news. Congratulations on the promotion. John. James accepted the younger man's handshake, noting the slight tremor that spoke to either nerves or alcohol. Congratulations to you as well. The dining room was a study in understated wealth. A mahogany table that seated 12, crystal that had been in the Ross family for 3 generations, and oil paintings of ancestors who'd made their fortunes in less regulated times. Ernest presided at the head of the table like a feudal lord, while his current wife, Maxine, played the perfect hostess. Maxine Ross was wife number 3, a former model turned society maven who'd married Ernest 5 years earlier. At 45, she was closer in age to her stepchildren than to her husband, a fact that created its own undercurrents of tension. She was beautiful, calculating, and utterly devoted to maintaining her position in New York society. So, Maxine began as the staff served the first course. Ernest tells me we're having some exciting changes at the office. Dad's finally giving me a real shot, John said, his words slightly slurred. Time to show what the next generation can do. Angelica looked between her father and husband, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. What kind of changes? Ernest cleared his throat. John will be taking over as chief investment officer, effective immediately. James has done wonderful work, but it's time for fresh perspectives. The silence that followed was deafening. Angelica's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, her dark eyes widening as the implications sank in. You're replacing James? Her voice was carefully controlled, but James could see the storm building behind her composed facade. I'm promoting family, Ernest corrected. James will transition to a new role. There are plenty of opportunities at Ross Capital. What new role? Angelica's question was directed at her father, but her eyes were on James. We're still working out the details, James replied smoothly. He'd spent the weekend deciding how to handle this moment, and he'd concluded that patience was his best weapon. Let Ernest reveal his true nature without prompting. I don't understand, Angelica continued. James has generated more profit for this company than anyone in its history. Our clients specifically request him. His reputation is exactly the problem, Ernest interrupted, his mask slipping slightly. James Escobar has become the face of Ross Capital. That's not how family businesses work. The Ross name comes first. John, either oblivious to the tension or enjoying it, raised his glass. To new beginnings. Are you out of your mind? Angelica's composure finally cracked. James has made you hundreds of millions of dollars. He's never had a losing quarter. He's not family. Ernest's voice was ice cold. I built this company for my children, not for some outsider who got lucky with a few good trades. The insult hung in the air like poison gas. James felt Angelica's hand find his under the table, her grip tight with suppressed fury. That's enough, she said quietly. We're leaving. Sit down, Angelica. Ernest's command carried the weight of 31 years of paternal authority. This is business, not personal. Business. Angelica stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You're destroying a man's career out of petty jealousy and calling it business? I'm protecting my family's legacy, Ernest shot back. Something you'd understand if you hadn't been so blinded by pretty words and false promises. James felt something snap inside him. Not anger, but clarity. For 7 years, he'd tried to earn Ernest's respect, to prove himself worthy of the Ross name. But respect couldn't be earned from someone incapable of giving it. Angelica, James said quietly, it's all right. She turned to him, her eyes blazing. It's not all right. This is insane. Your husband understands the situation, Ernest said smugly. Perhaps you should take lessons from him in accepting reality. That was the moment James decided Ernest Ross needed to learn what reality actually looked like. You're right, James said, standing slowly. I do understand the situation. Better than you might think. Ernest's smug expression flickered slightly. Good. Then we can move forward without unnecessary drama. Oh, there won't be any drama, James agreed. Just consequences. Meaning, James smiled. A cold, predatory expression that made Maxine shiver and John reach for his wine glass. Meaning you've just made the most expensive mistake in Ross Capital's history. But you'll figure that out soon enough. Are you threatening me? I'm stating a fact. You want to play family politics with a $2 billion portfolio? You want to put your alcoholic son in charge of institutional investments? Go ahead. But when it all comes crashing down, remember that you chose this. Ernest's face turned purple. You signed a non-compete. You can't work in this industry for 2 years. I'm aware of the terms, James replied calmly. Just like I'm aware of the retention clauses in our major client contracts, the SEC regulations regarding portfolio manager changes, and the very specific fiduciary duties that come with managing other people's money. But I'm sure John learned all about that at Harvard. John's face had gone ashen. What retention clauses? James's smile widened. The ones that allow clients to withdraw their investments within 30 days of any management changes they don't approve of. But don't worry. I'm sure they'll all be thrilled to trust their retirement funds to someone whose biggest success was managing his trust fund. You son of a bitch, Ernest growled. You're trying to sabotage my company. I don't need to sabotage anything, James replied. You've done that yourself. I'm just not going to clean up the mess this time. He turned to Angelica, offering her his arm. Ready to go home? She nodded, still stunned by the rapid escalation of events. As they reached the dining room door, Ernest called out, This isn't over, James. I'll destroy you for this. James paused, looking back at the older man. Ernest, you just destroyed yourself. You're just too arrogant to see it yet. The drive home was silent until they reached the city. Then Angelica finally spoke. What retention clauses? James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The ones I convinced our major clients to add to their contracts 3 years ago, just in case something like this ever happened. You've been planning for this? I've been planning for every contingency, James corrected. That's what good portfolio managers do. Angelica stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. What are you going to do? James's smile returned. Not cold this time, but genuinely warm. I'm going to give your father exactly what he asked for. A Ross family business. And then I'm going to show him what happens when you mistake loyalty for weakness. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of New York weather that matched the mood in the Ross Capital offices. James arrived at his usual time, 6:30 a.m., to find John Ross already in the main conference room, surrounded by legal documents and looking like a man facing execution. Morning, John, James said pleasantly, setting his coffee on the table. Ready for your first day as CIO? John looked up with bloodshot eyes. James, look, about yesterday, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Did we? James settled into his chair with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. I thought your father made his position quite clear. Yeah, well, Dad gets emotional sometimes. Maybe we can work something out. A partnership, maybe? Co-sell us. James studied the younger man with clinical interest. John Ross was everything James wasn't. Privileged, entitled, and utterly unprepared for the reality of high-stakes financial management. Where James had clawed his way up from a middle-class background in Queens, working 3 jobs to pay for college and learning every aspect of the business from the ground up, John had coasted on his name and his father's connections. That's generous, John, but your father was very specific. Fresh blood, new perspectives. The next generation of leadership. Christ, James, half our clients don't even know who I am. The Pemberton Pension Fund, the university endowments, the sovereign wealth funds, they all specifically contracted for your management. Which brings us to an interesting legal question, James replied, pulling out a thick folder. Tell me, what do you know about fiduciary responsibility? John's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean that as of this morning, you're legally responsible for $2 billion in client assets. Every decision you make, every trade you execute, every recommendation you provide, it all has to meet the highest standard of professional care. One mistake, one decision that can't be justified as being in the client's best interest, and you're personally liable. Personally liable for what? Everything. Your trust fund, your apartment, your car, your future earnings. When you manage other people's money, John, you put everything you own on the line. Joyce Maxwell appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. Mr. Escobar, the Pemberton Fund is on line 1. They want to discuss the management transition. James checked his watch. Right on schedule. John, why don't you take that call? As the new CIO, they'll want to hear directly from you. Wait, I need to prepare. There's no time to prepare. Mr. Pemberton is a $100 billion pension fund. They don't wait. James pushed the phone toward John. Line 1. With trembling fingers, John pressed the speakerphone button. This is John Ross. The voice that emerged was crisp, authoritative, and distinctly unimpressed. Mr. Ross, this is Robert Kramer, Chief Investment Officer for the Pemberton Fund. We need to discuss the sudden change in portfolio management. Of course, Mr. Kramer. I'm excited to continue the excellent work that. Mr. Ross, our contract specifically names James Escobar as the designated portfolio manager. Any changes require our written approval, which we have not provided. John looked desperately at James, who merely smiled and sipped his coffee. I understand your concern, John stammered, but I assure you that Ross Capital will continue to provide the same level of... Mr. Ross, do you have Mr. Escobar's track record? What do you mean? 15 years of consecutive profitable quarters. Average annual returns of 18% above market benchmarks. 0 compliance violations. 0 client complaints. Do you have equivalent experience? The silence stretched uncomfortably before John finally answered. Not exactly the same experience, but then we're exercising our right to withdraw our assets immediately. Please have the transfer paperwork ready by close of business. The line went dead. John stared at the phone as if it had betrayed him personally. That's $400 million, James observed casually. Don't worry, though. I'm sure the others will be more understanding. As if summoned by his words, Joyce appeared again. The Harvard Endowment on line 2. Columbia University on line 3. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is holding on line 4. John's face had gone from pale to green. This is a setup. You orchestrated this. I orchestrated nothing, James replied truthfully. I simply prepared for the inevitable. These clients invested with me personally, not with Ross Capital. When you remove me from the equation, they remove their money from the equation. Basic cause and effect. The office door burst open, and Ernest Ross stormed in like an aging hurricane. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, his silver hair uncombed, his face flushed with fury. What the hell is going on? He demanded. I've got 3 calls from major clients threatening to pull their assets. Good morning, Ernest, James said pleasantly. John and I were just discussing the transition. Don't play games with me, you arrogant little prick. You're sabotaging my company. Your company, James repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words. Because according to the quarterly reports I filed on Friday, Ross Capital Management currently has $2.1 billion under management. Of that, approximately $1.6 billion is tied to contracts that specifically name me as the portfolio manager. Ernest's bluster faltered slightly. Those contracts can be modified, only with client approval, which, as John just discovered, isn't exactly forthcoming. The phone rang again. Joyce's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Ross? The teacher's retirement fund. They are not happy. Ernest sank into a chair, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his arrogance. You can't do this. The non-compete prevents me from working for a competitor or starting my own firm. James finished. It doesn't prevent clients from exercising their contractual rights. I'm not soliciting anyone, Ernest. I'm not making recommendations. I'm simply not preventing the natural consequences of your decision. You smug bastard, Ernest snarled. You think you're untouchable? James leaned forward, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. I think I'm a man who spent 15 years building something magnificent, only to watch you try to destroy it out of petty jealousy. I think I'm someone who earned every dollar of success through hard work and intelligence, while you've spent your life believing that accident of birth makes you superior to everyone else. I made you. I gave you everything. You gave me an opportunity, James corrected. I made everything else myself. And now you're about to lose it all because you couldn't stand seeing an outsider succeed in your little kingdom. Ernest's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and winced. The board wants an emergency meeting. I'm sure they do. Losing 70% of your assets under management in a single morning tends to get people's attention. This isn't over. James stood, straightening his jacket. Actually, Ernest, it is. You want a Ross family business? Congratulations. You got one. Of course, it's going to be a much smaller business. But blood is thicker than water, right? Where are you going? James paused at the door. I'm going to clean out my office. I believe that was your original request. Wait. Ernest's desperation was palpable. We can work something out. A partnership. You and John together. Really? Because yesterday you made it very clear that I wasn't family. That I was just an outsider who got lucky with a few good trades. Are you saying you were wrong? Ernest's face twisted with the effort of swallowing his pride. Maybe I was hasty. No, James said quietly. You were honest. For the first time in 7 years, you told me exactly what you thought of me. And now I'm returning the favor. He turned to John, who was still staring at the phone as if it might explode. Good luck, John. You're going to need it. James, please, John pleaded. I can't do this. Then you shouldn't have agreed to replace me. As James walked toward his office, he could hear Ernest's voice rising behind him, the sound of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. By the time James finished packing his personal items, the office was in chaos. phones ringing constantly, junior analysts running between offices with printouts, and the sound of Ernest Ross screaming at anyone within earshot. James paused at Joyce's desk on his way out. "Joyce, it's been a pleasure working with you." She looked up from her computer, where she was tracking the exodus of clients in real time. "Mr. Escobar, for what it's worth, I think they're making a terrible mistake." "No," James replied with a smile that was both sad and satisfied. "They're getting exactly what they deserve." As he walked out of Ross Capital Management for the last time, James's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Robert Kramer, Pemberton Fund." James deleted the message without reading it twice. The non-compete would prevent him from taking any new positions for 2 years, but there were other ways to ensure justice was served. Ernest Ross had taught him that loyalty was a weakness, that family meant everything, and that blood was thicker than water. It was time to show Ernest just how wrong he'd been about all three. Chapter 4. The Foundation. 2 weeks after James's departure from Ross Capital, the financial press was having a field day. Exodus at Ross Capital. Management shakeup triggers client flight, read the headline in the Wall Street Journal. Ross Capital hemorrhaging assets after personnel changes, announced Financial Times. Bloomberg was even less diplomatic. Ross Capital in free fall as star manager exits. James read the articles from his home office in their Upper East Side apartment, a cup of coffee growing cold beside his laptop. The numbers were devastating. Ross Capital had lost $1.8 billion in assets under management in just 2 weeks. John Ross had lasted exactly 6 days as chief investment officer before suffering what his publicists described as exhaustion. Ernest had been forced to take personal control of the remaining portfolios, but his rusty skills and increasingly erratic behavior were driving away the few clients who hadn't already fled. "You're actually enjoying this," Angelica observed from the doorway. She was dressed for work in a sharp navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in a professional chignon. Since the disaster at her father's company, she'd thrown herself into her job at Peterson & Associates, one of Manhattan's premier mergers and acquisitions firms. "I'm observing the natural consequences of poor decision-making," James replied mildly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She settled into the chair across from his desk, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for contract negotiations. "You orchestrated this entire collapse. I did nothing illegal, unethical, or even particularly clever. I simply prepared for contingencies and allowed events to unfold naturally." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Angelica leaned forward, her expression serious. "James, I've known you for 7 years. I've seen you handle crises, market crashes, difficult clients, regulatory investigations. You're always calm, always in control, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. This wasn't just preparation. This was warfare." James saved his document and closed the laptop, giving her his full attention. "Would you prefer I had rolled over and accepted your father's decision? Let him destroy my career and reputation while pretending it was for the good of the family? I would prefer my husband not orchestrate the destruction of my father's company out of revenge." "Your father destroyed his own company out of arrogance," James corrected. "I just didn't prevent it." They stared at each other across the desk, 7 years of marriage and partnership suddenly feeling fragile. Angelica had been caught in the middle from the beginning, loving both her husband and her father, understanding both perspectives but unable to reconcile them. "Tell me something," James said quietly. "When your father announced he was replacing me with John, what was your first thought?" "Honest answer." Angelica was quiet for a long moment. "That he was making a terrible mistake." "And your second thought?" "That you wouldn't let him get away with it." James nodded slowly. "Then you knew me better than your father did." Ernest Ross spent 7 years thinking I was a grateful son-in-law who would accept whatever scraps he threw my way. He never bothered to learn who I actually am. "And who are you exactly?" The question hung between them like a challenge. James stood and walked to the window, looking out at Central Park where early autumn was painting the leaves in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm the son of Maria and Carlos Escobar," he said finally. "My father worked 3 jobs to support our family: security guard at night, construction during the day, and weekend maintenance at an office building in Queens. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Manhattan, taking the subway at 5 in the morning so she could have their breakfast ready when they woke up. Angelica knew these basic facts about his background, but she'd never heard him talk about his childhood with such raw honesty. When I was 12, James continued, my father got injured on a construction site, fell from scaffolding, and broke his back. The contractor fought the workers' compensation claim, said it was Dad's fault for not following safety protocols. The medical bills destroyed us. We lost our house, had to move in with my aunt in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. James, I'm not finished. His voice was quiet but firm. My mother took on extra houses to pay for Dad's physical therapy. I got a job delivering newspapers before school, working in a grocery store after school, anything to help. And you know what I learned during those years? Angelica waited. I learned that fairness is a luxury only wealthy people can afford. I learned that hard work and loyalty mean nothing if you don't have power to back them up. And I learned that when powerful people decide to destroy you, your only choice is to destroy them first. He turned from the window, his gray eyes intense. Your father thought he could discard me like a used tissue because I didn't have the right last name. He thought my gratitude would keep me compliant, that my love for you would make me accept his decision quietly. He was wrong about everything. So this is about more than just the job. This is about respect, James said simply. I spent 15 years earning earnest respect through my work, my results, my dedication. But respect can't be earned from someone who fundamentally believes you're beneath them. Your father never saw me as an equal, never saw me as family. I was just a useful tool who had outlived his purpose. Angelica was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. What happens now? Now your father learns what it means to truly lose everything. Not just money. Money can be replaced. But reputation, trust, credibility? Those take decades to build and seconds to destroy. And us. James moved to her chair, kneeling beside it, and taking her hands. Us is not negotiable. You're my wife, my partner, my best friend. Whatever happens with your father doesn't change that. Even if I don't agree with your methods. Even then. He squeezed her hands gently. But I need you to understand something, Angelica. I'm not the same man who walked into your father's office 7 years ago, grateful for any opportunity. That man was willing to endure insults and condescension because he thought it was the price of success. This man knows better. What are you planning? James smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. I'm planning to show your father that some mistakes have permanent consequences. Before Angelica could respond, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. James Escobar. Mr. Escobar, this is Luther Zimmerman from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss certain irregularities at Ross Capital Management. James felt a chill run down his spine, but his voice remained steady. What kind of irregularities? The kind that require federal investigation. How soon can you come in? James looked at Angelica, whose face had gone pale. I'll need to consult with my attorney first. Of course. But Mr. Escobar, don't take too long. We have questions about your role in the recent client exodus, and there are some people who think you may have engaged in market manipulation or breach of fiduciary duty. The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his mind racing through the implications. What was that about? Angelica asked. Your father just escalated this conflict to a whole new level, James replied grimly. He's trying to have me investigated for securities fraud. Can he do that? James's smile returned, but this time it was cold as winter moonlight. He could try, but Ernest Ross just made his second mistake. The first was underestimating me. The second was giving me a legitimate reason to destroy him completely. James, I need to make some calls, he said, already reaching for his laptop. This changes everything. As Angelica watched her husband transform from contemplative to predatory, she realized that the quiet, controlled man she'd married had always been capable of this level of focused ruthlessness. She'd just never seen him with a worthy opponent before. The real war was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Investigation. The offices of Whitman Cobb and Associates occupied 3 floors of a midtown Manhattan tower, and partner Douglas McCarty's corner office commanded a view of both the Hudson River and the organized chaos that was New York's legal district. At 58, McCarty was one of the city's most respected securities attorneys, a former federal prosecutor who'd made his reputation dismantling white-collar criminals before switching sides to defend them. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," McCarty said, reviewing the documents James had provided. "Your former father-in-law terminated your employment, installed his unqualified son as your replacement, and when their clients exercised their contractual right to withdraw their assets, he reported you to the SEC for market manipulation?" "That's an accurate summary," James replied. He sat across from McCarty's desk with the relaxed posture of a man who'd prepared for this eventuality years in advance. "And you're telling me you took no action to encourage these client departures?" "I took no action whatsoever. I followed the terms of my non-compete agreement to the letter. I haven't contacted a single client, made any recommendations, or provided any advice regarding their investments." McCarty leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "James, I've been practicing securities law for 30 years. I've seen every dirty trick, every gray area maneuver, every creative interpretation of fiduciary duty. What you did was absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure I follow. You didn't need to contact the clients directly. You'd already structured their contracts to protect them, and yourself, from exactly this scenario. When Ernest Ross removed you as portfolio manager, he triggered automatic withdrawal clauses that you'd negotiated years earlier. The clients aren't fleeing because you told them to. They're fleeing because their contracts require them to. The retention clauses were standard risk management," James said carefully. "Many institutional investors prefer name manager provisions." "Bullshit," McCarty said cheerfully. "You were planning for this exact scenario. The question is, can the SEC prove it? Can they?" McCarty opened another file folder, this one containing communications between the SEC and Ross Capital's legal team. "Ernest Ross provided them with copies of your employment contract, client agreements, and trading records going back 5 years. He's alleging that you structured these arrangements specifically to damage Ross Capital if you were ever terminated. That would be difficult to prove, since the arrangements benefited both the clients and the firm." "Exactly. The retention clauses protected client interests by ensuring continuity of management. The withdrawal provisions gave them flexibility to respond to changes they didn't approve of. From a legal perspective, you were doing your job. From a practical perspective," McCarty's smile widened, "you were building the perfect revenge mechanism." James remained silent, his expression neutral. "The SEC is going to interview you next week," McCarty continued. "They're particularly interested in your communications with clients over the past month, any advance warning you might have given about management changes, and whether you violated your non-compete agreement." "I haven't violated anything." "I know, which is what makes this so beautiful. Ernest Ross is essentially asking the federal government to investigate his own incompetence." McCarty closed the files and fixed James with a direct stare. "But there's something else going on here, isn't there? This feels personal." "It is personal." "Care to elaborate?" James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Ernest Ross built his company on the premise that family loyalty trumps everything else. Competence, performance, ethics, none of that matters as much as blood relations. He spent 30 years surrounding himself with people who share that philosophy. And now he's discovering the limitations of that approach. He's discovering that the rest of the world doesn't share his values. Institutional investors don't care about family dynasties. They care about returns, risk management, and fiduciary responsibility. When Ernest removed me and installed John, he was telling his clients that family connections matter more than their financial security. McCarty nodded slowly. They didn't appreciate the message. They responded exactly as any rational investor would respond when a fund manager prioritizes nepotism over performance. "So what's your endgame here?" "The SEC investigation will likely be dropped within a month once they realize there's no evidence of wrongdoing. Ross Capital will eventually stabilize, probably at a much smaller size. Ernest learns his lesson, maybe brings you back, maybe doesn't. Where does this end? James's expression hardened. It ends when Ernest Ross understands that some people can't be discarded without consequences. It ends when he realizes that loyalty is a two-way street. It ends when he pays a price that actually matters. And what price would that be? Everything. McCarty studied his client with professional interest. In 30 years of practice, he'd represented politicians, CEOs, hedge fund managers, and tech billionaires. He'd seen ego, greed, and revenge in every conceivable form. But there was something different about James Escobar, a cold, calculating patience that suggested this confrontation was far from over. James, I need to ask you directly. Are you planning to do anything that might constitute securities fraud, market manipulation, or breach of fiduciary duty? No. Are you planning any actions that might be considered illegal or unethical? Define unethical. McCarty's eyebrows rose. That's not a reassuring answer. I'm not planning to break any laws, James clarified. But I am planning to ensure that Ernest Ross experiences the full consequences of his decisions. Some of those consequences might be uncomfortable. I strongly advise you to stay within legal boundaries. I intend to. The law is actually quite useful for what I have in mind. Before McCarty could respond, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mr. McCarty? There's a Robert Kramer here to see Mr. Escobar. Says it's urgent. James and McCarty exchanged glances. Kramer was the CIO of the Pemberton Fund, one of the first clients to withdraw from Ross Capital. Send him in, McCarty said. Robert Kramer was a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to managing vast sums of money. He entered the office with the efficient stride of a man who valued time above all else. Mr. Escobar, he said without preamble, we need to discuss your future. Mr. Kramer, I appreciate the interest, but my non-compete agreement prevents you from working for a competitor or starting your own firm for 2 years. I'm aware of the terms. Kramer settled into the chair beside James. I'm not here to offer you a job. Then why are you here? To propose a partnership. Pemberton Fund manages pension assets for over 2 million teachers, firefighters, police officers, and public employees. We need sophisticated investment management, but we also need managers who understand fiduciary responsibility. Managers who put client interests first. James remained silent, waiting for the proposition. We're prepared to make you a consulting partner, Kramer continued. You wouldn't be managing assets directly, so the non-compete wouldn't apply. You'd be advising on strategy, risk management, and due diligence. In exchange, we pay you a base fee plus a percentage of returns above benchmark. McCarty leaned forward. What kind of base fee? $5 million annually, plus 20% of excess returns. For reference, excess returns on our current portfolio run about $40 million per year. The offer was staggering, potentially $15 million annually for part-time consulting work. It was also a clear message to the financial community that institutional investors valued James's expertise far more than Ernest Ross had realized. That's generous, James said carefully, but I need to understand the scope of the work. Strategy consulting, portfolio analysis, due diligence on investment managers. Kramer's smile was slight but meaningful. We might also need advice on withdrawing assets from underperforming funds. The implication was clear. Pemberton Fund was preparing to systematically withdraw investments from any firm that demonstrated poor management or questionable ethics. Given their size and influence, other institutional investors would likely follow their lead. I'll need to review this with my attorney, James said. Of course. But Mr. Escobar, I want you to understand something. What happened at Ross Capital is being watched closely by everyone in our industry. The way Ernest Ross treated you, the priorities he demonstrated, the incompetence he revealed, it's made a lot of people very nervous about their own managers. Meaning there's about to be a significant consolidation in our industry. Institutional investors are going to become much more selective about who they trust with their assets. Firms that prioritize nepotism over competence, that treat talented managers poorly, that demonstrate questionable judgment, they're going to find themselves without clients very quickly. After Kramer left, McCarty and James sat in silence for several minutes. Well, McCarty said finally, that changes the dynamic considerably. How so? You've just become the most powerful unemployed person on Wall Street. If Pemberton Fund is offering you that kind of package, other institutional investors will follow. You'll have influence over hundreds of billions in assets. James nodded slowly. And Ernest Ross is about to discover that destroying my career was the worst business decision he's ever made. James, McCarty said seriously, you need to be very careful here. The line between legitimate business competition and personal vendetta can be thin. Don't cross it. I won't need to cross it, James replied. Ernest is going to destroy himself. I'm just going to make sure everyone has a front row seat. Chapter 6, The Unraveling. 3 months after James's departure from Ross Capital, the company's quarterly board meeting convened in the mahogany-paneled conference room that had once symbolized Ernest Ross's dominance over New York's financial elite. Now it felt more like a war room under siege. The board members, 5 of Manhattan's most prominent business leaders, sat around the polished table with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed panic. Assets under management had plummeted from $2.1 billion to $400 million. The firm's reputation was in tatters. And Ernest Ross, at the head of the table, looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 months. Let's dispense with pleasantries, said Philip Byers, the board's chairman and managing partner of a major law firm. Ernest, your company is hemorrhaging money, clients, and credibility. We need to discuss immediate action. Ernest's bloodshot eyes swept the table, searching for allies he no longer had. The market's been volatile. We're experiencing temporary challenges. Temporary, interrupted Diane Hoover, CEO of a major insurance company. You've lost 80% of your client base. The SEC investigation may be closed, but the damage to your reputation is permanent. Our own due diligence team is recommending we withdraw our pension fund from your management. You're overreacting, Ernest insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. We're rebuilding with quality clients, focused management. Ernest, said Clark Walter, a real estate magnate who'd known Ernest for 20 years, you need to face reality. James Escobar was the foundation of this company's success. When you removed him, you removed the primary reason clients chose Ross Capital. John is perfectly capable. John is in rehab, Philip Byers stated flatly. For the second time in 3 months. Your son couldn't handle the pressure of managing a lemonade stand, much less institutional investments. The silence that followed was deafening. Ernest's face reddened, but for once, he seemed to have no response. We've received several inquiries, continued Byers, about the possibility of selling Ross Capital's remaining assets to larger management firms. Given the current situation, it might be the most responsible course of action. Sell. Ernest's voice cracked. This is my company. My life's work. Your life's work is currently worth about 10 cents on the dollar, Diane observed coldly. And it's declining daily. As if summoned by the mention of declining value, Joyce Maxwell appeared in the doorway. She'd remained at Ross Capital throughout the chaos, partly out of loyalty and partly because few companies were hiring assistants from a firm under federal investigation. Mr. Ross. Her voice was carefully neutral. There's a delegation here to see you. What kind of delegation? Representatives from the Teachers' Retirement Fund, the Police Pension Alliance, and the Municipal Workers Union. They're requesting an immediate meeting. Ernest exchanged glances with the board members. The 3 organizations represented the last significant institutional clients still with Ross Capital, accounting for nearly $200 million of the firm's remaining $400 million in assets. Send them in, Philip Byers said when Ernest seemed incapable of responding. The delegation that entered was led by Wendy McCullough, the formidable chief investment officer for the Teachers' Retirement Fund. A former Marine turned financial manager, she had a reputation for protecting her members' interests with ruthless efficiency. Gentlemen, she began without preamble, we're here to inform you that our 3 organizations will be withdrawing our assets from Ross Capital Management effective immediately. Ernest lurched to his feet. Wendy, you can't be serious. We've managed your assets for over a decade. Which is exactly why this decision is so painful, she interrupted. But we can no longer trust Ross Capital to prioritize our members' financial security over family politics. What are you talking about? Wendy opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. 3 months ago, you fired the most successful portfolio manager in your firm's history and replaced him with your unqualified son. That decision has cost our members approximately $40 million in lost returns. The market has been challenging for everyone. The market has been fine for competent managers, Wendy stated. Our consultants have analyzed the performance of firms using similar strategies to what James Escobar employed at Ross Capital. They're averaging 12% returns this quarter. You're averaging negative 3%. Clark Walter leaned forward to examine the documents. These are comparative performance analyses conducted by our independent consultants, confirmed Wendy. They clearly demonstrate that Ross Capital's underperformance correlates directly with Mr. Escobar's departure and your son's management decisions. Ernest's face was now purple with rage and humiliation. You're basing financial decisions on office gossip. We're basing financial decisions on mathematical analysis and fiduciary responsibility, Wendy corrected. Our members are teachers, firefighters, and public workers who depend on their pension funds for retirement security. We cannot allow personal vendettas to jeopardize their futures. Personal vendettas? Mr. Ross, everyone in our industry knows why you fired James Escobar. It wasn't performance-based. It wasn't strategic. It was family politics, pure and simple. You prioritized your son's career over your client's financial interests. Ernest opened his mouth to argue, but Wendy wasn't finished. Furthermore, we've received detailed analyses from Pemberton Fund's new consulting partner regarding Ross Capital's risk management practices. The report identifies several concerning trends that suggest fundamental problems with your current approach. What consulting partner? Asked Philip Byers. James Escobar, Wendy replied simply. He's been retained by Pemberton Fund to evaluate institutional investment managers. His analysis of Ross Capital's recent performance is unflattering. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Ernest staggered backward, gripping the edge of the table for support. That's impossible, he whispered. He has a non-compete agreement, which doesn't prevent him from providing consulting services to institutional investors, Wendy explained. Mr. Escobar has been very careful to remain within legal boundaries while demonstrating the consequences of poor management decisions. Clark Walter began laughing, a bitter, incredulous sound. Jesus Christ, Ernest. He's systematically destroying your company, and he's doing it completely legally. The withdrawal process will be completed within 30 days, Wendy announced. We're sorry it's come to this, but our fiduciary duty is clear. After the delegation left, the board members sat in stunned silence. The loss of the 3 pension funds would reduce Ross Capital's assets under management to approximately $200 million, barely enough to keep the lights on. We need to discuss immediate liquidation, Philip Byers said finally. No, Ernest said quietly. There has to be another way. Ernest, face reality. Your company is finished. James Escobar has turned the entire institutional investment community against you. Every client you lose makes the next departure easier. It's a death spiral. Then I'll rebuild. Start over. Prove him wrong. Diane Hoover shook her head sadly. With what? You have no credible portfolio managers, no institutional relationships, and a reputation that's toxic throughout the industry. Even if you could attract new capital, who would trust you to manage it? Ernest Ross sat down heavily, the weight of his situation finally breaking through his denial. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing complete and utter defeat. There is one option, Clark Walter said slowly. You could approach James directly. Apologize. Offer him partnership. Try to salvage something from this disaster. Never, Ernest snarled. I'll burn this company to the ground before I grovel to that arrogant prick. Then you'll get your wish, Philip replied. Because that's exactly what's happening. As the board members filed out of the conference room, Ernest remained seated at the table, staring at the documents Wendy McCullough had left behind. The performance analyses were damning, but what truly crushed his spirit was the realization that James Escobar had orchestrated this entire collapse without breaking a single law or regulation. He'd been outplayed by a man he considered inferior, outwitted by someone he dismissed as a grateful employee. And the most humiliating part was that James had never lied to him. He'd warned Ernest explicitly that removing him would have consequences. He'd predicted exactly what would happen. Ernest Ross had simply been too arrogant to listen. Chapter 7. The Final Gambit. 6 months after his departure from Ross Capital, James Escobar sat in his home office reviewing the latest quarterly reports from his consulting clients. The Pemberton Fund's portfolio had grown by $180 million under his strategic guidance. The Teachers' Retirement Fund had achieved record returns. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund had formally requested his advisory services for their North American investments. His consulting fees for the quarter exceeded $12 million. Across town, Ross Capital Management was preparing for bankruptcy proceedings. "You're actually going to enjoy this," Angelica observed from the doorway. She was holding a cup of coffee and the morning edition of the Financial Times, whose headline read, "Ross Capital Collapse, a case study in management failure." "I'm going to find it satisfying," James corrected, saving his document. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because you've been planning this endgame for months." James leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's expression. Their relationship had weathered the storm of his conflict with her father, but not without casualties. Angelica had been forced to choose between supporting her husband's methodical destruction of her father's company or maintaining family loyalty. She'd chosen James, but the cost had been significant. "Your father destroyed his own company," James said gently. "I just didn't prevent it by systematically turning every major institutional investor against him, by providing honest, professional analysis of his management decisions. When pension funds ask me to evaluate investment managers, I give them accurate information. If that information reflects poorly on Ross Capital, that's Ernest's fault, not mine." Angelica settled into the chair across from his desk. "The bankruptcy filing will be public next week." "I know. He'll lose everything. The company, the Hamptons house, most of his personal assets." "I know. James, he's my father." James reached across the desk and took her hand. "And he made a series of choices that led to this outcome. I didn't force him to fire me. I didn't force him to install John as CIO. I didn't force him to prioritize family politics over client interests. Every consequence he's facing is the direct result of his own decisions. But you could stop it. Even now, you could probably save Ross Capital if you wanted to." "Could I? And should I?" The question hung between them like a challenge. After 6 months of watching her father's empire crumble, Angelica was struggling with the morality of James's approach. What would that teach him? James continued, "That he can discard people without consequences? That loyalty is meaningless? That talent and dedication are less important than family connections? It would teach him mercy, forgiveness." "No," James said firmly. "It would teach him that other people will always clean up his mistakes. Ernest Ross has spent his entire life believing that his actions don't have permanent consequences. It's time he learned otherwise." Before Angelica could respond, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar number that made his blood run cold. Ernest Ross. James hadn't spoken to his former father-in-law since their confrontation 6 months earlier. He considered letting the call go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Ernest, James." The voice on the other end was barely recognizable. Hoarse, defeated, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined Ernest Ross. "I need to see you. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Please, one conversation, face to face." James looked at Angelica, who was watching him with intense curiosity. "Where?" "My office. This afternoon. Just you and me." The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his mind racing through possibilities. After 6 months of silence, Ernest Ross was ready to talk. The question was whether James was ready to listen. "He wants to meet," James told Angelica. "Are you going?" "I think I have to. This has gone on long enough." 2 hours later, James walked through the familiar lobby of the Ross Capitol building for the first time since his departure. The changes were immediately apparent. The bustling energy was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of quiet desperation. The receptionist he recognized was gone, replaced by a temp agency worker who barely looked up from her computer. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to a mausoleum. Half the offices were empty, their former occupants having fled to competitors or been laid off in successive rounds of cost-cutting. The remaining staff moved through the halls like survivors of a natural disaster. Ernest's office door was open, and James could see his former father-in-law sitting behind his desk, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. At 65, Ernest looked 20 years older, his hair completely white, his face gaunt, his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. "Hello, Ernest." Ernest turned slowly, his eyes focusing on James with visible effort. "Thank you for coming. You said you wanted to talk. Sit down, please." James remained standing. "I think I'll stay here." Ernest nodded as if he'd expected this response. "I suppose I deserve that. You deserve a lot of things." "James, I need you to understand something. When I fired you, when I brought John in to replace you, I thought I was protecting my family's legacy. I know what you thought. I was wrong." The admission seemed to cost Ernest tremendous effort. About everything. About John, about family loyalty, about what this company really needed. "I was wrong about you." James remained silent, waiting. "You were never just an employee," Ernest continued. "You were the heart of this company, the reason it succeeded, the reason our clients trusted us. And I threw that away because I was jealous of your talent, your success, the respect you earned. I built this company from nothing, James, but you made it great. And instead of being grateful, I resented you for it." Ernest stood slowly, moving to the window where James had once planned his days. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "The company, the clients, the reputation I spent 30 years building. My son is in rehab again. My wife is talking about divorce. The bankruptcy filing will be public next week. I know you know." Ernest turned to face James directly. "I know you orchestrated all of it. I did nothing illegal or unethical. No, you did something much more devastating. You did exactly what you said you would do. You gave me what I asked for, a Ross family business. And you let me discover what that was really worth." James felt no satisfaction in Ernest's admission, only a kind of weary completion. "What do you want from me, Ernest?" "I want to offer you the company." The words hit James like a physical blow. "What?" "Ross Capital Management. What's left of it? The name, the remaining assets, the infrastructure. I'm prepared to sign over controlling interest to you." "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the only way any of this means anything. If the company dies with me, then 30 years of work disappears. But if you take it over, if you rebuild it, maybe something survives." James stared at the older man, searching for the catch, the hidden manipulation. But Ernest's desperation seemed genuine. "And what would you get in return?" "The satisfaction of knowing I made one right decision before it was too late." "No," James said quietly. "What would you really get?" Ernest's facade cracked slightly. "A chance that my daughter might forgive me. A hope that my grandson might inherit something other than bankruptcy and shame." There it was, the real motivation. Even in defeat, Ernest Ross was trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. "You're still trying to use family loyalty to get what you want," James observed. "Yes," Ernest admitted, "because it's the only thing I have left." James walked to the window, looking out at the city where he'd built his reputation and destroyed Ernest's. After 6 months of systematic revenge, he felt empty rather than triumphant. "I'll consider your offer," he said finally. "James, I'll consider it. But understand something, Ernest. If I take over Ross Capital, it won't be your company anymore. It won't be a family business. It'll be a meritocracy where talent matters more than bloodline, where loyalty is earned rather than demanded. I understand. Do you? Because there won't be a place for John in my company. There won't be special treatment for family members. There won't be nepotism or preferential treatment based on last names." Ernest nodded slowly. "I understand. Then we'll talk again next week." after the bankruptcy filing is complete. As James walked toward the door, Ernest called out one last time. James? For what it's worth. I'm sorry. James paused without turning around. You're not sorry for what you did, Ernest. You're sorry it didn't work. The silence that followed was answer enough. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The bankruptcy proceedings for Ross Capital Management were held in a sterile federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place where American dreams went to die officially. James arrived early, taking a seat in the gallery, where he could observe without being noticed. He wasn't a creditor or debtor, just a witness to the final chapter of Ernest Ross's empire. The courtroom slowly filled with lawyers, creditors, and financial journalists. Ernest sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, looking like a man attending his own funeral. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a shell of defeated arrogance. Judge Lee Jacobs, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, called the proceedings to order with the efficient brutality that bankruptcy court demanded. We're here today to address the petition for Chapter 11 reorganization filed by Ross Capital Management, she announced. Mr. Ross, you may proceed. Ernest's attorney, a tired-looking man who clearly wished he were anywhere else, began the litany of financial failure. Assets worth $200 million against debts of $180 million. Operational losses of $15 million per quarter. No viable path to profitability without major restructuring. Your Honor, the attorney continued, my client requests court approval for the sale of Ross Capital's remaining assets to Escobar Capital Management, a newly formed investment firm. James felt every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. He'd filed the incorporation papers for Escobar Capital Management the previous week, along with the paperwork necessary to acquire Ross Capital's assets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Mr. Escobar, Judge Jacobs said, please approach the bench. James walked forward, acutely aware that this moment would define the rest of his career. The judge reviewed his financial statements, corporate structure, and proposed acquisition terms with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen every possible variation of financial collapse. Your offer is for $12 million cash for all remaining assets, she noted. That's correct, Your Honor. Including the Ross Capital name and client relationships? Yes, Your Honor, though I intend to rebrand the firm as Escobar Capital Management. Mr. Ross, the judge turned to Ernest. Do you agree to these terms? Ernest struggled to his feet, his dignity hanging by threads. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. The sale is approved. And just like that, 30 years of Ernest Ross's life work legally became James Escobar's property. After the proceedings, James found Ernest waiting in the courthouse lobby. The older man looked lost, like a tourist in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. It's done, Ernest said simply. It's done, James agreed. They stood in uncomfortable silence for several moments before Ernest spoke again. What happens now? Now you retire, James replied. You take your remaining personal assets, move to Florida or Arizona, and disappear from the financial world forever. And John needs to find his own path, preferably in an industry that doesn't require fiduciary responsibility. Ernest nodded slowly. And Angelica? Angelica is my wife. This doesn't change that. She hates me now. She's disappointed in you. There's a difference. Ernest looked around the courthouse lobby, perhaps realizing this would be his last conversation with James as anything approaching an equal. For what it's worth, he said, you won. Completely and totally. I underestimated you from the beginning. You didn't underestimate me, James corrected. You never bothered to see me at all. You saw what you wanted to see. A grateful employee who would accept whatever scraps you threw his way. And now you know better. Ernest extended his hand, a final gesture of respect or surrender. James considered leaving him hanging, but ultimately shook it briefly. Goodbye, Ernest. Goodbye, James. As Ernest walked away, his footsteps echoing in the marble lobby, James felt the strange emptiness that comes with completing a long-term project. 6 months of careful planning had culminated in this moment. Ernest Ross's complete and utter defeat. But victory, James discovered, felt different than he'd expected. Less triumphant, more exhausted. His phone buzzed with a text from Angelica. "How did it go?" "It's over," he replied. "Everything. Everything." James left the courthouse and walked through Lower Manhattan, past the memorial sites, and toward the financial district where he'd built his reputation. In 3 days, he would take control of Ross Capital's remaining assets and begin the process of rebuilding. Several former clients had already expressed interest in returning once the Ross name was removed. But first, he had one more conversation to complete. He found Angelica waiting in their apartment, staring out at Central Park where autumn was giving way to winter. She turned when he entered, her expression unreadable. "Is it finished?" she asked. "The bankruptcy is complete. I now own what's left of your father's company. And how does that feel?" James considered the question seriously. "Empty. Necessary, but empty. Do you regret it?" "No. Your father needed to learn that actions have consequences. But I don't feel good about it." Angelica moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. "He called me this afternoon, and he wanted me to know that he understands now. What you are. What he lost when he fired you. Too little, too late. Maybe. But James, I need you to understand something too." She turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. "What you did over the past 6 months, it was brilliant, ruthless, and completely justified. But it also showed me a side of you I'd never seen before." "What side?" "The side that's capable of destroying someone completely and feeling nothing about it." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you saying you're afraid of me?" "I'm saying I'm afraid of what you might become if you let that side take control. My father created an enemy when he fired you. I don't want to see you become the kind of person who creates enemies out of everyone who disappoints you. That's not who I am, isn't it?" "James, you spent 6 months systematically destroying my father's life. You isolated him, humiliated him, bankrupted him, and then bought his company for pennies on the dollar. You did it all legally, professionally, and without a moment's hesitation. He earned every bit of it." "Maybe he did. But what happens the next time someone crosses you? What happens when an employee disappoints you, or a client questions your judgment, or a competitor tries to steal your business? Do you destroy them too?" The question hung between them like an accusation. James realized that in his focus on defeating Ernest Ross, he'd never considered what victory might cost him personally. "I did what I had to do," he said finally. "I know. And I supported you because you were right. But James, don't let winning this war change you into someone I can't recognize." James pulled her into his arms, feeling the fragility of their relationship for the first time in their marriage. "I won't," he promised. "This was about justice, not revenge. Ernest Ross taught me that loyalty means nothing if you don't have the power to defend it. I'll never be that vulnerable again, but I won't become him either. Promise me." "I promise." But as they stood together in their apartment, watching the last light fade from the autumn sky, James wondered if some transformations were irreversible. He'd set out to teach Ernest Ross a lesson about respect and consequences. The question was whether he'd learned something about himself in the process, something that couldn't be unlearned. Chapter 9. New Foundations. 1 year later, Escobar Capital Management occupied the entire 42nd floor of a Manhattan tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city where James had rebuilt his empire from the ashes of Ernest Ross's arrogance. The firm managed $3.2 billion in assets, employed 47 of the industry's top analysts and portfolio managers, and had achieved the remarkable feat of being oversubscribed, turning away potential clients because demand exceeded capacity. James stood in his corner office, reviewing the quarterly performance reports that would be delivered to clients the following week. Every number told the same story: exceptional returns, conservative risk management, and client satisfaction ratings that set industry standards. "Mr. Escobar," Joyce Maxwell's voice came through the intercom. She'd followed James from Ross Capital, along with most of the senior staff who'd recognized which side of the conflict held the future. "The Harvard Endowment is here for their quarterly review. Send them in." The delegation that entered represented $53 billion in assets and Harvard University's commitment to long-term financial stability. Dr. Patricia Haas, the endowment's chief investment officer, led a team of analysts and trustees who'd entrusted Escobar Capital with $800 million, their largest single investment outside of Harvard Management Company itself. James, Dr. Haas said warmly, settling into the conference table that dominated half his office. I have to say, these preliminary numbers are extraordinary. 22% returns year to date, added her deputy, Thomas Chun. That's nearly double our benchmark expectations. James distributed bound copies of the detailed performance analysis he'd prepared. The returns are gratifying, but I want to walk you through the risk parameters as well. Strong performance means nothing if it's achieved through excessive risk-taking. For the next hour, James presented a comprehensive analysis of every investment decision, market assumption, and risk calculation that had driven their portfolio success. It was the kind of transparency that had built his reputation. Clients didn't just see results, they understood exactly how those results were achieved. This is why we chose Escobar Capital, Dr. Haas said as the presentation concluded. Not just the performance, but the philosophy. You treat our assets like they belong to your own family. Because they do, James replied simply. Every dollar you invest represents a student's education, a professor's research, a breakthrough that might change the world. That responsibility drives every decision we make. After the Harvard delegation left, James returned to his desk to find a message from his assistant. Your 3 p.m. appointment is here. He'd blocked the time for a meeting, but hadn't specified the nature or attendee. Curious, he walked to the reception area to find a familiar figure waiting in one of the leather chairs. John Ross had aged considerably in the year since his father's bankruptcy. The boyish arrogance was gone, replaced by something approaching humility. He'd lost weight. His expensive clothes had been replaced by an off-the-rack suit, and his hands showed the slight tremor of someone still fighting addiction. Hello, James. John. James gestured toward his office. Let's talk privately. Once the door closed, John seemed to struggle with where to begin. I wanted to thank you, he said finally. For what? For buying Dad's company instead of letting it die completely. For keeping some of the staff employed. For, John paused, gathering his courage. For not destroying me personally when you had every reason to. James leaned back in his chair, studying Ernest's son with clinical interest. You destroyed yourself, John. I didn't need to help. I know, but you could have made it worse. Blacklisted me from the industry entirely. Made sure I never worked in finance again. Is that what you want? To work in finance again? John's laugh was bitter. God, no. I was never cut out for this world. I only tried because Dad expected it. Because I thought it was my birthright. So what are you doing now? Teaching. High school mathematics in Brooklyn. The pay is terrible, the hours are long, and most of my students think I'm an idiot. John's smile was genuine for the first time James could remember. I love it. You're teaching high school. Turns out I'm pretty good at explaining complex concepts to people who don't want to learn them, which, considering my experience with institutional investors, makes perfect sense. Despite himself, James felt a flicker of respect for the man sitting across from him. How's your father handling your career change? Dad doesn't speak to me anymore. Says I'm wasting my education, embarrassing the family name. John shrugged. But there's no family name anymore, is there? You made sure of that. Your father made sure of that when he prioritized family politics over fiduciary responsibility. I know. And James, I need you to know that I understand why you did what you did. Dad treated you terribly. He dismissed your talent, disrespected your contributions, and tried to throw you away like garbage. You had every right to defend yourself. James remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was leading. But I also need you to understand something else, John continued. My father isn't evil. He's just broken. He built his identity around being the patriarch of a financial dynasty. And when you proved that bloodline meant less than talent, it shattered everything he believed about himself. And you think that excuses his behavior? No, but it explains it. Dad spent his whole life believing that family loyalty was the highest virtue, that taking care of your own people mattered more than anything else. When he fired you and hired me, he thought he was protecting his family's future. He was protecting his ego. Maybe. Probably. But James, I've spent the last year thinking about what happened, and I've realized something. You and Dad are more alike than either of you wants to admit. James's expression hardened. Explain. You both believe that loyalty is the highest virtue. You both put family above everything else. You both view the world in terms of us versus them. John leaned forward, his voice earnest. The only difference is that you're better at protecting the people you love. That's not, isn't it? Everything you did over the past year was designed to protect your reputation, your career, your future with Angelica. You identified Dad as a threat to your family's security, and you eliminated that threat completely. James felt uncomfortable with the comparison, but he couldn't entirely dismiss it. The difference, he said carefully, is that I never betrayed anyone's trust. I never prioritized personal relationships over professional responsibility. No, you just made sure that anyone who crossed you paid a price they'd never forget. The accusation hung in the air between them. James realized that John Ross, the failed heir, the recovering addict, the high school math teacher, had identified something about him that he'd never fully acknowledged. What do you want from me, John? Nothing. I just wanted you to know that I understand what happened, why it happened, and that I don't blame you for it. But I also wanted to ask you something, which is, what kind of man do you want to be going forward? The kind who builds something great, or the kind who destroys anyone who threatens him? Before James could respond, John stood and moved toward the door. For what it's worth, he said, pausing at the threshold, I think you're a good man who did what he had to do. But good men can become dangerous when they convince themselves that destruction is the same thing as justice. After John left, James sat alone in his office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, where other ambitious men were building their own empires and plotting their own revenge. The conversation had unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. His phone buzzed with a text from Angelica. Dinner tonight? I have news. Good news or bad news? He replied. Life-changing news. James smiled despite his philosophical discomfort. Whatever John Ross thought about his character, whatever questions he might have about his own motivations, one thing remained constant: his love for Angelica and their shared future. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing investment strategies and client portfolios, but his mind kept returning to John's question. That evening, Angelica was waiting in their apartment with champagne and an expression he'd never seen before. Nervous excitement mixed with pure joy. What's the news? He asked, pulling her into his arms. We're going to have a baby. The words hit him like lightning, instantly recontextualizing everything in his life. His empire, his success, his victory over Ernest Ross. Suddenly none of it mattered compared to the miracle of new life. Are you sure? I'm sure. 12 weeks. James picked her up and spun her around their living room, both of them laughing with the giddy happiness of people whose lives had just changed forever. As they celebrated with champagne, sparkling cider for Angelica, James felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a warm blanket. He was going to be a father. He was going to be responsible for shaping another human being's understanding of the world. James, Angelica said as they sat together on their couch, I want our child to know their grandfather. The statement stopped him cold. Ernest, he's the only grandfather our baby will have. Your parents are gone, and despite everything that's happened, he's still my father. James felt the familiar surge of anger at the mention of Ernest Ross, but underneath, it was something new, the realization that holding grudges might cost his child a relationship with family. Angelica, after everything he did was to me and to you. It has nothing to do with our baby. She took his hand, her grip gentle but firm. James, I'm not asking you to forgive him or trust him or do business with him. I'm asking you to consider that revenge becomes meaningless when it starts affecting innocent people. He's not innocent. Our child is. James stared into his wife's eyes, seeing not just love, but wisdom. She was asking him to make a choice between the satisfaction of continued punishment and the possibility of healing. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to let go. You won, completely and permanently. Ernest knows it. I know it. The entire financial world knows it. You've proven everything you needed to prove. And if I let him back into our lives, what happens when he tries to manipulate our child the way he manipulated everyone else? Then we set boundaries. We protect our family without destroying his. Angelica placed his hand on her still flat stomach. This baby is going to grow up in a world where their father is one of the most successful investment managers in history. I want them to understand that success came from talent and hard work, not from the ability to destroy enemies. James thought about John Ross's question about the kind of man he wanted to be. For the first time in over a year, he considered the possibility that complete victory might require mercy rather than continued punishment. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask." As they sat together planning their future, James realized that the most important decision of his life wasn't about business strategy or competitive advantage. It was about the kind of father he wanted to be, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave, and the kind of world he wanted to create for his child. Ernest Ross had taught him that loyalty without power was meaningless. But perhaps it was time to learn a different lesson. That power without mercy was just another form of weakness. The war was over. Now came the much harder task of building a lasting peace. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Harvey Stewart had built his life like he built his bridges, methodically, with precision, and designed to last. At 42, he commanded respect in the construction industry, not just for his engineering brilliance, but for his reputation as a man who never broke his word. His dark eyes held an intensity that made contractors nervous and clients confident. When Harvey Stewart shook your hand on a deal, it was better than any contract. 15 years ago, he'd married Jennifer Miller, the radiant daughter of construction mogul John Miller. Jennifer, with her golden hair and charming smile, had been the prize every man in their social circle coveted. Harvey had won her heart with his ambition and unwavering loyalty, qualities that her father, John, had immediately recognized and respected. John Miller had built Miller Construction from nothing into a regional powerhouse. At 68, with silver hair and weathered hands, he was finally ready to step down. Harvey had worked tirelessly for the past decade, transforming from son-in-law to indispensable partner. The company's most profitable contracts bore Harvey's signature. His innovative designs had won industry awards, and his project management had earned Miller Construction a reputation for delivering impossible builds on schedule. The Stewarts lived in a sprawling colonial in Westchester County, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn that Jennifer fussed over every weekend. Their two children, 15-year-old Michael and 13-year-old Sarah, attended private school and wanted for nothing. From the outside, Harvey Stewart had achieved the American dream. But Harvey had always been observant. Little things had started nagging at him over the past year. Jennifer's late nights shopping with friends, her newfound interest in fitness that required expensive personal training sessions, and her sudden criticism of his workaholic tendencies. She'd grown distant, answering his questions with rehearsed responses and avoiding his touch with practiced excuses. Then there was Kelvin Hart. Kelvin had joined Miller Construction 8 months ago as the new business development director. A smooth talker with perfectly styled dark hair and an expensive wardrobe that screamed new money. John had hired him despite Harvey's reservations, claiming they needed fresh blood to expand into new markets. Kelvin was younger, flashier, and had an MBA from Wharton that he mentioned in every conversation. Harvey had noticed how Jennifer's demeanor changed whenever Kelvin was around. How she laughed too loudly at his jokes during company events. How she'd started wearing perfume to casual family barbecues when Kelvin attended. How she developed opinions about business strategies she'd never cared about before. The signs were there, subtle, but unmistakable to a man who built his career on paying attention to details others missed. Harvey had said nothing, waiting and watching, because Harvey Stewart was not a man who acted on suspicion. He acted on certainty. 3 weeks ago, Harvey had hired a private investigator, not some sleazy divorce specialist, but Roland Bruce, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate intelligence. Roland's report sat locked in Harvey's office safe. 43 pages of documented proof that his wife of 15 years was having an affair with Kelvin Hart. Hotel receipts, photographs, credit card statements showing expensive gifts Harvey had never seen Jennifer wear at home. But the betrayal went deeper than adultery. According to Roland's investigation, Jennifer and Kelvin had been planning for months. John Miller's retirement party wasn't just a celebration. It was an ambush. The board meeting scheduled for the morning after the party would vote on Harvey's removal from the company. Kelvin would slide into Harvey's position. Jennifer would get a profitable divorce settlement, and Harvey would be left with nothing but the shame of his professional and personal failure. They'd underestimated him completely. Harvey closed the investigator's report and placed it back in his safe. Tomorrow night, at John Miller's retirement party, Jennifer would smile and tell him to grab the champagne. He would find that termination letter exactly as they planned. But what Jennifer and Kelvin didn't know was that Harvey Stewart had spent the last 3 weeks preparing his own surprise. He'd liquidated personal investments they didn't know about, moved assets Jennifer couldn't track, and made phone calls to people who owed him favors spanning 15 years in the industry. Harvey had built his reputation on loyalty and keeping his word, but he'd also built it on never forgetting a betrayal. As he sat in his study that evening, watching Jennifer read bedtime stories to Sarah through the window, Harvey felt no sadness. The time for sentiment had passed the moment she chose to conspire against him instead of simply asking for a divorce. Jennifer had declared war by involving his career, his reputation, and his relationship with John Miller. Harvey Stewart had never lost a war. Chapter 2. The Revelation. The Miller estate buzzed with celebration. 200 guests filled the grand ballroom, toasting John Miller's remarkable 40-year career. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over men in expensive suits and women draped in designer gowns. The who's who of the construction industry had gathered to honor a legend, and Harvey played his part perfectly, the devoted son-in-law, proud of his mentor's legacy. Jennifer looked stunning in her emerald dress, the one she'd claimed was for special occasions. Harvey now knew she'd worn it to her hotel meetings with Kelvin. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting compliments on her father's success while playing the role of supportive wife. Kelvin Hart worked the room like a predator marking territory. He'd positioned himself near the board members, laughing at their jokes and presenting himself as the future of Miller Construction. Harvey watched him with detached curiosity, noting how Kelvin's confidence had grown over the past month. The man actually believed he'd outmaneuvered Harvey Stewart. John Miller approached the podium for his speech, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in business. "Building isn't just about concrete and steel," he said, his eyes finding Harvey in the crowd. "It's about trust, loyalty, and legacy. I'm proud to pass this company to people who understand those values." The irony wasn't lost on Harvey. John genuinely believed he was protecting the company by removing his son-in-law. Jennifer had poisoned her father's mind with carefully crafted stories about Harvey's declining performance and concerning judgment calls. Kelvin had provided the business case, presenting a restructuring plan that painted Harvey as a liability rather than an asset. As the applause died down, Jennifer appeared at Harvey's side, her smile radiant for the cameras. "Honey," she said, her voice honey-sweet with false affection, "would you grab a champagne from the coat check? Father wants to make a private toast with the family." Harvey nodded, playing his part one final time. "Of course, darling." The coat check area was dimly lit and empty. Harvey found the box Jennifer had described, wrapped in gold paper with an elegant bow. His hands were steady as he opened it, though his heart rate didn't change when he saw the contents. The termination letter was typed on Miller Construction letterhead, signed by all 7 board members. His final paycheck lay beneath it, along with a sticky note in Jennifer's handwriting. The board voted. "You're fired." For a moment, Harvey simply stared at the note. Not at the words, but at Jennifer's handwriting, the same script that had written "I love you" in birthday cards for 15 years. The same hand that had signed Christmas cards to the Stewart family every year. The same hand that had written their wedding vows. Harvey folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Then he pulled out his phone and made the call he'd been planning for 3 weeks. "Bruce? It's Harvey Stewart. Execute Phase 1. When he returned to the ballroom, the family had gathered in John Miller's private study. Jennifer stood beside her father, radiant with victory. Kelvin lingered near the bookshelf, trying to look casual while clearly savoring the moment. John held a bottle of Dom Perignon, waiting for Harvey's return. "There's my boy," John said warmly. "One last toast between family before I officially step down." Harvey smiled, accepting the crystal flute. "To family," he said, raising his glass, "and to getting exactly what we deserve." They drank, and Harvey watched Jennifer's eyes. She was practically glowing with triumph, probably imagining the life she'd build with Kelvin, using Harvey's destroyed reputation as their foundation. Neither she nor Kelvin noticed that Harvey's phone was buzzing constantly in his pocket. "Well," Harvey said, setting down his empty glass, "I should let you all enjoy the rest of the evening. I have some calls to make." He kissed Jennifer's cheek. She actually leaned into it, still playing the loving wife, even in her moment of victory, and shook John's hand. "Thank you for everything, John. You've taught me more than you know." As Harvey walked toward the exit, he felt his phone vibrating again. By morning, 37 missed calls from Bruce Andrews, Miller Construction's corporate lawyer, would be waiting. But tonight, Harvey Stewart was driving home to set Phase 2 in motion. Jennifer and Kelvin had won the battle, but they'd made a critical error. They thought Harvey Stewart was just another casualty of corporate politics. They were about to learn that Harvey Stewart was a man who built bridges, and a man who knew exactly how to burn them down. Chapter 3. The Architect's Plan. Harvey's home office had been transformed into a war room. 3 laptops hummed quietly on his desk, displaying financial reports, legal documents, and construction project timelines. The investigator's report lay open beside a yellow legal pad filled with Harvey's meticulous handwriting. He'd been working since 4 a.m., and by dawn, the foundation of his counterattack was complete. The first call came at 6:23 a.m. Bruce Andrews, Miller Construction's corporate lawyer, sounded panicked. "Harvey, where the hell are you? We need to talk." "The Riverside Municipal Project, Jesus Christ, Harvey, the entire contract is structured around your personal engineering license. If you're terminated, we're in breach of a $40 million project. The city can sue us for 3 times that amount." Harvey let the call go to voicemail. Then the next one, and the next. By 7 a.m., his phone showed 13 missed calls from Bruce, 11 from John Miller, and surprisingly, 7 from Kelvin Hart. Jennifer had called twice, her voice progressing from confused to furious. At exactly 8 a.m., Harvey answered his phone. "Harvey Stewart." "Harvey, thank God. This is Bruce. We have a situation. That termination letter. There are complications we didn't anticipate. Several major contracts are tied to your personal certifications. We need to discuss a transition plan." "I'm afraid that's impossible, Bruce. My termination was effective immediately, according to the board's decision. I'm no longer a Miller Construction employee. But the contracts are Miller Construction's responsibility, not mine. I was just an employee, remember? Good luck with the lawsuits." Harvey ended the call and immediately placed another one. "Eugene, it's Harvey Stewart. Yes, I know it's early. I'm ready to discuss your offer." Eugene Bender was Harvey's former MIT roommate and current CEO of Bender Engineering, one of the largest construction firms on the East Coast. For 2 years, Eugene had been trying to poach Harvey from Miller Construction with increasingly generous offers. Harvey had always declined out of loyalty to John Miller. Loyalty was no longer a factor. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, Harvey Stewart was the new chief engineering officer of Bender Engineering, with a salary 30% higher than his Miller Construction pay, equity in the company, and a signing bonus that made the termination payout look like pocket change. More importantly, his new contract included a non-compete clause that prevented him from working on any projects that might compete with Bender Engineering. Every major project in Miller Construction's pipeline would now face a conflict of interest challenge if they tried to replace Harvey with another firm that employed him. Harvey's phone rang again. John Miller this time. Harvey, son, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, John. I received my termination letter last night. It was quite clear. The board made that decision based on some concerns about. The board made that decision based on bad information, Harvey interrupted. Information provided by people who don't understand the complexity of our current contracts. But that's not my problem anymore. Harvey, please. Whatever Jennifer told you about last night. Jennifer told me to grab the champagne. I did. Everything else I learned from the termination letter you signed. There was a long pause. The Riverside project is a Miller Construction project. I'm sure Kelvin Hart has it well in hand. He did present himself as my replacement, didn't he? After ending the call, Harvey walked to his safe and removed a manila folder he'd prepared 3 weeks ago. Inside were copies of every contract, every project detail, and every engineering specification that made Harvey Stewart irreplaceable. Not the originals. Those belonged to Miller Construction. But Harvey's memory, his personal notes, and his understanding of structural requirements couldn't be terminated with a letter. His phone rang again. Jennifer. Harvey, where are you? I woke up and you were gone. Your car is in the shop. Harvey lied smoothly. I took a cab to the office to clean out my desk. About last night. What about it? Your father's retirement party was lovely. Very memorable. Harvey, I know you're upset about the company restructuring, but I'm not upset, Jennifer. I'm making new plans. We should talk when I get home. But Harvey had no intention of going home. Not yet. He had 3 more calls to make, and then a meeting with his new employer. By the time Jennifer realized the scope of what her betrayal had cost, Harvey Stewart would be 30 miles away, designing the destruction of everything she thought she'd won. The last call was to Roland Bruce, his investigator. Roland? It's Harvey. I need you to expand the surveillance. I want to know every move they make, every conversation they have, and every person they contact. And Roland? Start Phase 3. Phase 3 was Harvey's favorite part of the plan. While Jennifer and Kelvin celebrated their corporate coup, they were about to discover that Harvey Stewart was not just an engineer. He was an architect, and he'd been designing their downfall for 3 weeks. They thought they'd fired Harvey Stewart. What they'd actually done was unleash him. Chapter 4. The Foundation Cracks. The Bender Engineering offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Hartford, 40 miles from the Miller Construction headquarters. Harvey's new corner office overlooked the Connecticut River, and from his window, he could see construction sites where his designs were reshaping the skyline. Eugene Bender had welcomed him like a conquering hero, and by noon, Harvey was already reviewing project proposals that would make Miller Construction's pipeline look modest. His former phone continued buzzing with calls he didn't answer. Instead, Harvey focused on his new responsibilities while Roland Bruce fed him real-time intelligence about the chaos erupting at his former workplace. Jennifer had arrived at Miller Construction at 10 a.m., expecting to find Harvey clearing out his office in defeat. Instead, she found pandemonium. Bruce Andrews was shouting into 3 phones simultaneously. John Miller was locked in emergency meetings with the board, and Kelvin Hart was frantically reviewing contracts he'd never properly understood. The Riverside Municipal Project was the immediate crisis. The city had invested $40 million in Harvey's innovative bridge design, which required his personal engineering seal and ongoing supervision. Miller Construction's termination of Harvey triggered a breach of contract clause that exposed them to liquidated damages exceeding $100 million. But Riverside was just the beginning. Harvey had spent 15 years building relationships with municipal planners, state transportation departments, and federal project managers. His reputation had opened doors that Miller Construction couldn't have accessed otherwise. The company's most prestigious contracts, the Metro-North Railway expansion, the Harbor Restoration Project, the new courthouse complex, all contained provisions that made Harvey's involvement essential. Kelvin Hart was discovering that business development meant more than PowerPoint presentations and networking lunches. The technical specifications Harvey had developed couldn't be replicated by reading his files. The relationships Harvey had cultivated couldn't be transferred with a handshake. The innovation that had made Miller Construction a premier firm was walking out the door in a custom-tailored suit. At 2 p.m., Harvey's assistant knocked on his office door. "Mr. Stewart? There's a Jennifer Stewart here to see you. She says she's your wife." Harvey looked up from the structural plans he was reviewing for a casino project in Atlantic City. A project Miller Construction had bid on, but lost to Bender Engineering 6 months ago. "Send her in." Jennifer entered like a woman walking into battle. Her designer suit was armor. Her smile was a weapon, and her eyes held the cold calculation Harvey had failed to see for too many years. She was beautiful, brilliant, and absolutely furious. "Hello, darling," she said, closing the door behind her. "Lovely new office. Very impressive. Thank you." Eugene spared no expense. "Eugene Bender, your new employer." Jennifer moved to the window, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Funny how quickly you found a new position. Almost like you were planning this." Harvey leaned back in his leather chair, studying his wife with the same attention he gave structural blueprints. "Planning what? Finding work after being terminated? I'd call that basic financial responsibility. Don't play games with me, Harvey. The Riverside project is falling apart. 3 other contracts are in jeopardy. Daddy's company is facing lawsuits that could destroy 40 years of work. And what does that have to do with me? I was terminated yesterday, remember? Miller Construction made it clear that my services were no longer needed." Jennifer's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury beneath. "You're sabotaging the company out of spite. I'm protecting my professional reputation. Every contract I signed was based on my personal guarantee of engineering excellence. If Miller Construction no longer wants my involvement, they can't use my reputation to secure their projects. The board is willing to reconsider the termination. Daddy wants to offer you a partnership, full restoration of your position, even a raise." "How generous," Harvey interrupted. "And what changed their minds? Yesterday, I was a liability who needed immediate removal. Today, I'm partnership material." Jennifer's composure cracked further. "Harvey, please. Whatever you think you know. I know that Kelvin Hart presented a business case for my removal 3 weeks ago. I know that you supported that recommendation. I know that you orchestrated last night's humiliation because you thought it would be dramatic and decisive." Jennifer stared at him, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "How could you possibly know about your affair?" Harvey's voice remained conversational, but his eyes held the cold precision that made contractors nervous. "Jennifer, I've known for months. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the late nights, the new clothes, the way you light up whenever Kelvin enters a room?" The silence stretched between them like a suspension cable under tension. Jennifer's breathing was shallow, her hands clenched at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "If you knew, why didn't you say anything?" "Because I needed to understand the scope of the betrayal. An affair is personal. Destroying my career was business. The moment you made it business, you declared war." Harvey stood and walked to his window, looking out at the construction sites below. "I built Miller Construction's reputation. I designed the projects that made your father proud. I created the innovations that separated his company from every competitor. And you threw all of that away for what? Better sex? A younger man? The thrill of betrayal? It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." Harvey turned to face her, and Jennifer stepped backward involuntarily. The man looking at her wasn't the devoted husband who'd brought her coffee every morning for 15 years. This was Harvey Stewart, the engineer, calculating load-bearing capacities and stress points with mathematical precision. "You wanted me destroyed, Jennifer. You're about to learn what that actually looks like." Jennifer's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and her face went white. "What is it?" Harvey asked, though he already knew. Roland Bruce was very punctual. "It's Kelvin. He says there's been a problem with the Metro North project. Some kind of inspection issue." Harvey smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Phase 4 just started. Chapter 5, Structural Failure. Kelvin Hart's office at Miller Construction looked like a hurricane had blown through it. Legal documents covered his desk, his laptop displayed 17 different crisis management emails, and his trash can overflowed with crumpled pages of calculations he couldn't make work. The man who'd been so confident 48 hours ago now looked like he hadn't slept since Jennifer's revelation about Harvey's knowledge. The Metro-North Railway expansion had hit its first major snag at 3:47 p.m. State transportation inspectors had arrived unannounced to review Harvey's innovative rail junction design. The problem wasn't with the engineering. Harvey's work was flawless. The problem was that Kelvin Hart couldn't explain it. The lead inspector, Miguel Fritz, was a 20-year veteran who'd worked with Harvey on 6 previous projects. He knew Harvey's methodology, trusted his calculations, and expected to discuss technical specifications with the project's chief engineer. Instead, he found Kelvin fumbling through files and making excuses about Harvey's sudden departure. "Where is Harvey Stewart?" Miguel had asked. "Mr. Stewart is no longer with the company," Kelvin replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Since when?" "Since yesterday." Miguel Fritz had stared at Kelvin for a long moment, then made a phone call. 30 minutes later, the entire Metro-North project was placed under regulatory review, pending verification of the engineering specifications by the original designer. Harvey learned about this development from his new office, where he was enjoying a cup of coffee and designing a more efficient rail junction for a competing bid. Eugene Bender had been delighted to learn that Miller Construction's Metro-North project was in jeopardy. Bender Engineering had submitted the original low bid for that contract, but lost to Miller Construction's innovative design. Harvey's innovative design. His phone rang at 4:15 p.m. "John Miller." "Harvey, please." "Miguel Fritz says the Metro-North project can't proceed without your direct involvement. The state won't accept Kelvin's oversight." "That's unfortunate," Harvey said, not looking up from his blueprints. "But I'm sure Miller Construction can find another qualified engineer. You know, there isn't another engineer in the region who understands that rail junction design. You created something completely new." "I did, and I own the intellectual property for that innovation. It's part of my personal engineering portfolio, not Miller Construction's assets." The silence on the other end was deafening. Harvey could practically hear John Miller's world collapsing. "Harvey, son, what do you want? Name your price. Partnership, equity, complete project control. I want you to honor the termination letter your board signed. I want Miller Construction to live with the consequences of their decision. And I want Jennifer to explain to you exactly why I'll never work for your company again." Harvey ended the call and immediately placed another one. "Roland, how's our friend Kelvin handling the pressure?" "Not well," Roland's gravelly voice replied. "He's made 7 calls to headhunters in the past 2 hours. Looks like he's planning an exit strategy." "Excellent. And Jennifer just left her father's office. She looked like she'd been crying. Should I continue surveillance?" "Absolutely. I want to know where she goes, who she sees, and what she does, especially if she meets with Kelvin." Harvey had anticipated this moment. Jennifer and Kelvin had built their relationship on shared ambition and mutual betrayal. When that ambition crumbled, the relationship would follow. People who could betray a spouse, an employer wouldn't hesitate to betray each other when the stakes got high enough. At 6 p.m., Harvey's prediction proved accurate. Roland sent a text. "Subjects meeting at the Meridian Hotel, room 1247. Same room they've used for 3 months. Harvey left his office and drove through Hartford's evening traffic, not toward the hotel, but toward the suburbs where his children waited for dinner. Michael and Sarah deserved to hear about their parents' divorce from their father, not from gossip or legal papers. They were innocents in this war, and Harvey intended to protect them from the worst of what was coming. But first, he had a stop to make. The Meridian Hotel's lobby was elegant and discreet, exactly the kind of place where successful professionals conducted private business. Harvey walked through it like he belonged there, nodding to the concierge and taking the elevator to the 12th floor. He didn't go to room 1247. He went to room 1249, which Roland had reserved under a false name 3 hours earlier. The adjoining rooms shared a thin wall, and Roland's surveillance equipment could pick up conversations clearly. Harvey put on headphones and listened to his wife and her lover discuss their crumbling plans. Can't handle the technical aspects, Jennifer was saying. Daddy's furious. The board is talking about emergency restructuring. I never said I could replace Harvey's engineering expertise, Kelvin replied. I said I could handle the business development side while we found technical contractors. We don't have time for contractors. We have deadlines, penalties, lawsuits. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to destroy your husband's career for fun. There was a sharp crack, the sound of Jennifer slapping Kelvin across the face. Don't you dare blame this on me. You wanted Harvey gone as much as I did. You said he was holding the company back from modern business practices. I said the company needed fresh leadership. I didn't say we should fire the one man who makes our projects work. Harvey smiled in the darkness. The foundation was cracking exactly as he designed it. So what do we do now? Jennifer asked. We salvage what we can. I'll take a position with another firm. You'll divorce Harvey quietly, and we'll rebuild somewhere else. And my father's company will survive or it won't. That's not our problem anymore. There it was. The moment Harvey had been waiting for. Jennifer and Kelvin weren't just betraying him. They were abandoning John Miller too. The old man who'd welcomed Kelvin like a son and trusted his daughter's judgment was about to discover that loyalty meant nothing to the people he'd tried to help. Harvey removed the headphones and left the hotel. He had one more call to make, and then he would go home to have dinner with his children. Tomorrow, Phase 5 would begin, and Jennifer would learn that Harvey Stewart hadn't just been building a career for 15 years. He'd been building an empire. Chapter 6, The Weight of Truth. Harvey found his children in the family room, sprawled across the sectional sofa with homework spread between them. Michael was hunched over trigonometry problems while Sarah worked on a science project about bridge construction, a coincidence that would have made Harvey smile under different circumstances. Dad, Sarah looked up, her face brightening. I'm doing my project on suspension bridges. Want to help? Maybe later, sweetheart. Right now, I need to talk to both of you about something important. Michael closed his math book, immediately sensing the gravity in his father's tone. At 15, he'd inherited Harvey's analytical mind and Jennifer's social instincts. Sarah, at 13, was more artistic but equally perceptive. Harvey sat across from them, choosing his words carefully. Your mother and I are going to get divorced. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's pencil slipped from her fingers. Michael's face went pale. Is it because of your job? Michael asked quietly. Mom said you got fired yesterday. The job situation is complicated, but no. Your mother and I have been having problems for a while. We've grown apart, and we want different things now. Harvey wouldn't tell them about the affair. Not yet. Maybe never. Children shouldn't carry the weight of their parents' betrayals. But they deserve to understand that their world was changing. Where will we live? Sarah's voice was small, scared. That's still being decided. But no matter what happens, both of your parents love you completely. This divorce is about problems between your mother and me, not about either of you. Michael leaned forward, his expression serious beyond his years. Dad, are you okay? You look different. Harvey studied his son's face, seeing Jennifer's features combined with his own determination. I'm handling a lot of changes right now, but I want you both to know that I'll always take care of you. Always. They talked for another hour, Harvey answering their questions as honestly as possible without revealing the scope of the war brewing around them. When Jennifer arrived home at 8:30 p.m., she found Harvey helping Sarah with her bridge project while Michael worked nearby. Harvey, Jennifer's voice was careful, controlled. Could I speak with you privately? They moved to Harvey's study, where the investigator's report still lay in his open safe. Jennifer noticed it immediately. How long have you been planning this? She asked. 3 weeks. Since I confirmed what I'd suspected for months. Jennifer sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly looking older than her 38 years. The children know we're getting divorced. They don't know why, and they won't unless you make it necessary. Harvey, please. Maybe we can work this out. Counseling, therapy. You conspired with your lover to destroy my career at your father's retirement party. You wanted me humiliated publicly, professionally ruined, and emotionally devastated. There's nothing to work out. Jennifer's composure finally cracked completely. Tears ran down her cheeks, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I never meant for it to go this far. Kelvin said it would be quick, clean, that you'd land on your feet. Kelvin Hart is a coward who's already planning to abandon you and your father's company. He told you exactly what you wanted to hear because he wanted exactly what you were offering. That's not true. It's exactly true. And Jennifer? It gets worse. Harvey opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. The display showed surveillance photos from Meridian Hotel, time-stamped just hours earlier. Jennifer and Kelvin in heated argument, her hand frozen mid-slap across his face. He's already starting to blame you for the company's problems. By next week, he'll be interviewing for positions at other firms. By next month, he'll be telling people that the affair was your idea, that you seduced him away from his professional judgment. Jennifer stared at the photos, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally, understanding. You've been watching us. I've been protecting myself. Everything I've done has been in response to your actions. You declared war, Jennifer. I'm simply better at fighting it. What do you want from me? Harvey closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. I want you to understand what you've lost. Tomorrow, Miller Construction will face its second major contract review. By Friday, your father will be looking at lawsuit exposure that could bankrupt the company. Next week, every major project in their pipeline will be in jeopardy. And you could stop all of that. I could, but I won't. Even if it destroys my father? He never hurt you, Harvey. He loved you like a son. John Miller signed my termination letter based on lies you, and Kelvin fed him. He chose to trust his daughter and her lover over 15 years of loyalty and results. That was his choice. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, processing the scope of the destruction Harvey had unleashed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. What about us? What about our family? We haven't been a family for months. We've been strangers living in the same house, playing roles for the children's benefit. The only difference now is that I'm not pretending anymore. Harvey stood and walked to his safe, removing a manila envelope he'd prepared that morning. Divorce papers. I'm keeping the house, my personal investments, and primary custody of the children. You'll receive spousal support for 5 years, enough to maintain a reasonable lifestyle while you rebuild your career. Primary custody? Jennifer's voice sharpened. You can't just take my children. I can and I will. The investigators' report documents your affair in detail. Your conspiracy to destroy my career shows calculated dishonesty. No family court judge will award primary custody to a mother who prioritized her lover over her family's stability. Jennifer took the envelope with shaking hands. Harvey, please. Don't do this. Don't destroy everything out of anger. Harvey walked to the door of his study, then paused and looked back at his wife of 15 years. I'm not destroying anything, Jennifer. I'm just letting you live with the consequences of what you built. As Jennifer sat alone in the study, Harvey returned to the family room to help Sarah finish her bridge project. Tomorrow would bring new crises, fresh revelations, and a next phase of his carefully constructed revenge. But tonight, he would be the father his children needed while their world fell apart around them. The foundation Jennifer and Kelvin had tried to destroy was proving stronger than they'd imagined. The structure they'd built their betrayal on was about to collapse completely. Chapter 7. The Collapse. The Miller Construction Emergency Board meeting convened at 7 a.m. on Friday morning, 3 days after John Miller's retirement party. The conference room that had hosted celebratory toasts just 72 hours earlier now felt like a funeral parlor. 7 board members sat around the mahogany table, their faces grim as Bruce Andrews delivered the legal assessment. Gentlemen, we're looking at potential liability exceeding $200 million. The Riverside Municipal Project alone carries liquidated damages of $112 million. Metro North is under regulatory review, which could trigger federal penalties. The Harbor Restoration Project is on hold pending engineering verification. John Miller sat at the head of the table, his retirement celebration photos still displayed on the credenza behind him. He looked like he'd age a decade in 3 days. How did this happen? Asked Carlton Glenn, the company's chief financial officer. Harvey Stewart was supposed to be a liability. Kelvin Hart assured us that replacing him would improve efficiency. All eyes turned to Kelvin, who sat at the far end of the table, looking like a man facing execution. His confident demeanor had evaporated completely, replaced by nervous sweat and darting glances toward the door. The business case was sound, Kelvin said weakly. No one anticipated that Harvey would react this way. React this way? John Miller's voice carried a dangerous edge. Son, Harvey didn't react. He planned. Every contract he signed included personal guarantees that made him irreplaceable. Every project he designed required his ongoing involvement. He built safeguards that protected the company and protected himself. But the restructuring plan was written by someone who didn't understand our business, John interrupted. Someone who thought construction was like any other industry where you could replace expertise with enthusiasm. Bruce Andrews cleared his throat. There's more. Harvey Stewart filed a defamation lawsuit yesterday afternoon. He's claiming that his termination was based on false information designed to damage his professional reputation. That's impossible, Kelvin said quickly. What false information? According to the lawsuit, you told the board that Harvey had made questionable judgment calls and shown declining performance. Harvey's filing includes performance reviews, client testimonials, and project success metrics that contradict every claim in your restructuring proposal. The room fell silent except for the humming of the air conditioning. Carlton Glenn was the first to speak. Kelvin, did you fabricate evidence against Harvey Stewart? I didn't fabricate anything. I presented concerns about leadership style, resistance to modern business practices. Show me documentation, John Miller said coldly. Show me one performance review, one client complaint, one project failure that supports your recommendation. Kelvin's face went white. It wasn't about documentation. It was about vision, about moving the company forward. It was about removing Harvey so you could take his position, Carlton said. And you convinced us to commit corporate suicide to make it happen. John Miller stood slowly, his hands flat on the conference table. Kelvin, you're terminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You can't do this. I have a contract. Your contract has a clause about material misrepresentation. You lied to this board about Harvey Stewart to advance your own career. That constitutes fraud. As security led Kelvin from the building, John Miller turned to Bruce Andrews. Can we fix this? Can we bring Harvey back? I've been trying to reach him all week. He won't take calls from anyone associated with Miller Construction. His attorney says he's only interested in discussing his defamation lawsuit. What would it take to settle that lawsuit? Public vindication, financial compensation, and a formal apology from the board for accepting false information about his performance. Done. What else? Bruce Andrews looked uncomfortable. John, Harvey doesn't want to come back. Bender Engineering announced his hiring yesterday. Full partnership, equity stake, and control over their East Coast expansion. He's not just employed. He's positioned to become our primary competitor. The reality of the situation settled over the room like concrete hardening. Harvey Stewart wasn't just leaving Miller Construction. He was joining their biggest rival with complete knowledge of their operations, their clients, and their vulnerabilities. There's something else, Bruce added quietly. Jennifer called this morning. She wanted to discuss the divorce settlement Harvey proposed. She seems to think the company might be able to influence his decisions. John Miller's face went ashen. What divorce settlement? Your daughter didn't tell you? Harvey filed for divorce on Wednesday. He's seeking primary custody of the children and alleging adultery as grounds. The silence that followed was broken only by Carlton Glenn's sharp intake of breath. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. Jennifer was having an affair. With Kelvin Hart, Bruce confirmed. Harvey's been building a case for months. He has documentation, surveillance, everything he needs to prove infidelity and conspiracy. John Miller sank back into his chair, his face gray. My own daughter conspired against Harvey? According to Harvey's attorney, Jennifer actively participated in planning his termination. She knew about Kelvin's false claims and supported them. The room erupted in angry voices, board members demanding explanations and assigning blame. But John Miller sat in silence, staring at the retirement photos that now seemed to mock him. His celebration had been built on a foundation of lies, and the son-in-law he'd trusted like his own blood had been betrayed by his own daughter. At exactly 9 a.m., as the board meeting descended into chaos, Harvey Stewart was 50 miles away in his new office, reviewing architectural plans for a casino complex in Atlantic City. His secretary had delivered 17 messages from Miller Construction personnel, all of which he'd ignored. Instead, Harvey was focused on the future. Bender Engineering had just won 3 major contracts previously held by Miller Construction competitors. By leveraging Harvey's reputation and relationships, Eugene Bender was positioning his firm to dominate the regional market. Harvey's phone buzzed with a text from Roland Bruce. Kelvin Hart terminated. Jennifer meeting with divorce attorney at 10 a.m. John Miller requesting emergency meeting with you. Harvey typed back, no meetings. Continue surveillance. Prepare Phase 6. Phase 6 was the final component of Harvey's plan, and it would ensure that Jennifer and Kelvin's betrayal had permanent consequences. They thought they were playing a simple game of corporate politics and marital infidelity. They were about to learn that Harvey Stewart played a much longer, more complex game. A game that he always won. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Jennifer sat in her car outside the law offices of Mitchell Conley, trying to summon the courage to walk inside. The divorce attorney Harvey had recommended was supposedly fair but thorough, which, coming from Harvey, probably meant he would dissect her life with surgical precision. Her phone buzzed with another call from her father. She'd been avoiding him since Wednesday night, unable to face the disappointment and anger in his voice. The empire John Miller had spent 40 years building was crumbling because his daughter had chosen passion over loyalty. Inside the law office, Mitchell Conley reviewed Harvey's proposal with professional detachment. At 62, he'd handled hundreds of divorce cases, but this one was particularly complex. Mrs. Stewart, your husband's settlement offer is comprehensive. He's documented extensive evidence of adultery, and his filings suggest premeditation in the destruction of his career. Premeditation, the timing of your affair correlating with business decisions affecting his employment. The coordinated effort to remove him from Miller Construction while you were involved with his replacement. It creates a pattern that suggests calculated betrayal rather than spontaneous infidelity. Jennifer stared at the legal documents spread across the conference table. What does that mean for me? It means your husband has built a case that portrays you not just as an unfaithful spouse, but as someone who actively conspired against your family's financial security. That significantly impacts custody considerations and spousal support calculations. But I'm their mother. You're a mother who prioritized her affair over her children's stability. The evidence shows you were planning to leave their father financially and professionally destroyed. No judge will ignore that when determining what's in the children's best interests. Jennifer's hands shook as she signed document after document, each one a testament to how thoroughly Harvey had outmaneuvered her. The custody arrangement gave her every other weekend and one evening per week. The spousal support would last 5 years and decrease annually. The house, the savings, the investments, everything stayed with Harvey. There is one unusual provision, Mitchell noted. Your husband is requiring that you sign a detailed statement acknowledging your role in his termination from Miller Construction. What kind of statement? A sworn affidavit admitting that you provided false information about his performance to justify his removal. It will be part of his defamation lawsuit against the company. Jennifer read the affidavit with growing horror. Every detail was accurate. Her conversations with Kelvin about Harvey's outdated approaches, her suggestions to her father about modernizing leadership, her active participation in building the case for Harvey's termination. If I sign this, what happens? Your husband drops his demands for additional punitive measures. If you refuse to sign it. Mitchell paused, consulting his notes. He's prepared to seek full custody and eliminate spousal support entirely. Jennifer signed the affidavit. Meanwhile, across town, Kelvin Hart was having his own reckoning. The security guards had escorted him from Miller Construction with nothing but the personal items from his desk. His corporate credit cards were canceled, his company car was repossessed, and his reputation in the industry was toxic. The headhunters he'd contacted earlier in the week were no longer returning his calls. Word had spread quickly through the tight-knit construction community that Kelvin Hart had fabricated evidence against Harvey Stewart, one of the most respected engineers in the region. No reputable firm would risk their credibility by hiring him. His apartment lease was in Jennifer's name, a precaution they'd taken to keep their affair discreet. With Jennifer facing her own financial constraints, Kelvin found himself without income, without prospects, and without allies. At 3 p.m., Kelvin made a desperate decision. He drove to Bender Engineering and requested a meeting with Harvey Stewart. Harvey agreed to see him. The Bender Engineering conference room was stark and modern, nothing like the warm mahogany atmosphere of Miller Construction. Harvey sat across from Kelvin with the same professional courtesy he'd shown to hundreds of contractors over the years. "What can I do for you, Kelvin?" "Harvey, I need you to know that the whole thing got out of hand. I never intended for it to go as far as it did." "You mean the affair or the conspiracy to destroy my career?" "Both. Neither. Look, Jennifer and I, it started as just attraction, but then she began talking about how you were holding the company back, how her father needed fresh leadership. I thought I was helping." Harvey leaned back in his chair, studying Kelvin with the analytical gaze that had made him successful. "You thought you were helping by lying about my performance? By fabricating evidence of poor judgment? I thought if you left voluntarily, everyone would benefit. You'd find a better position, the company would modernize, Jennifer would be happier. You thought you'd get my job, my wife, and my life. Everything else was just justification." Kelvin's composure cracked. "Please, Harvey, I know I fucked up, but I'm destroyed. No one will hire me. Jennifer won't even take my calls. I'm facing bankruptcy. And what would you like me to do about that? Recommend me. Vouch for my business development skills. Help me find a position somewhere that I can rebuild." Harvey was quiet for a long moment, considering the broken man across from him. When he finally spoke, his voice held no anger, no satisfaction, just cold, mathematical precision. "Kelvin, you try to destroy my career, my marriage, and my relationship with my children. You convinced my wife to betray me and my father-in-law to discard me. You built your future on the ruins of my life. I know, and I'm sorry. I don't want your apology. I want you to understand something about consequences. Every choice has them. Every action creates reactions. You chose to betray me, and now you're living with what that choice created." Harvey stood and walked to the window overlooking the construction sites below. "But you're right about one thing. You are destroyed. Your career is over. Your relationship with Jennifer is finished. Your reputation is permanently damaged." He turned back to face Kelvin. "And that's exactly what you deserve. Harvey, please. You can go now. Security will escort you out." As Kelvin was led from the building, Harvey returned to his desk and made one final call. "Roland? Phase 7. It's time to close the circle." Phase 7 was Harvey's ultimate gift to himself. The complete and total victory that would ensure neither Jennifer nor Kelvin could ever threaten him again. They destroyed his trust, his marriage, and his relationship with John Miller. Now Harvey Stewart would destroy them completely. Chapter 9. The Last Foundation. 6 months later, Harvey Stewart stood in his new office at Bender Engineering's expanded headquarters, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed his division's unprecedented success. The regional construction industry had experienced a dramatic reshuffling, with Miller Construction losing 60% of its major contracts and Bender Engineering emerging as the dominant firm in the Northeast. John Miller had been forced to sell Miller Construction to a Chicago-based corporation that immediately restructured the company, laying off 40% of the workforce. The proud family business that had taken 40 years to build was now just another subsidiary in a corporate portfolio. Harvey felt no satisfaction in the old man's downfall, but he felt no regret either. John Miller had made his choice when he signed that termination letter. The consequences were simply mathematics, actions and reactions, causes and effects. His children had adapted better than he'd expected. Michael, now 16, spent his weekends working on construction sites, learning the business from the ground up under Harvey's direct supervision. Sarah had thrown herself into her bridge-building projects with renewed passion, already talking about studying engineering like her father. Jennifer had moved to a modest apartment in Hartford, where she worked as a real estate agent for a small firm. The spousal support Harvey provided was sufficient but not generous, enough to maintain dignity, but not enough to fund the lifestyle she'd enjoyed during their marriage. She saw the children according to the court-mandated schedule, but the easy intimacy of their family relationships had been permanently altered. Kelvin Hart had disappeared entirely. Roland Bruce's final surveillance report indicated that he'd left Connecticut for parts unknown, probably using an assumed name to avoid the creditors and former colleagues who wanted answers about his role in Miller Construction's collapse. Some men rebuilt after destroying their lives. Others simply vanished. Kelvin had chosen the latter. Harvey's phone buzzed with a call from Eugene Bender. "Harvey, we just landed the Atlantic City Casino project. Congratulations, your design beat out 6 other firms, including some heavy hitters from New York." "Thank you, Eugene. I'll have the preliminary specifications ready for review next week." "There's something else. The Miller Construction properties are going up for auction next month. The old headquarters building, the equipment yards, even some of the residential developments John Miller started." Interested, Harvey considered the offer. Buying Miller Construction's assets would complete his victory in a poetic way. The company that had fired him would literally become his property. But something about the gesture felt empty. "Let me think about it," Harvey said. After ending the call, Harvey walked to his window and looked out at the Hartford skyline. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Jennifer was showing houses to potential buyers, living a life constrained by the choices she'd made. Somewhere beyond that skyline, Kelvin Hart was probably working some dead-end job under a false name, forever looking over his shoulder. They had both learned what Harvey Stewart was capable of when betrayed. The lesson had cost them everything. Harvey's secretary knocked on his door. "Mr. Stewart, there's a call from your daughter's school. Something about a bridge-building competition." Harvey smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "Put them through." 20 minutes later, he was driving towards Sarah's school to watch her present the suspension bridge model she'd been working on since her parents' divorce. The project had become her way of processing the chaos in her family, and Harvey had helped her refine the engineering principles behind her design. The school auditorium was filled with proud parents watching their children explain complex mechanical concepts with the enthusiasm only 13-year-olds could muster. Sarah's bridge was elegant and functional, incorporating lessons Harvey had taught her about load distribution and stress management. "The key to any strong bridge," Sarah explained to the judges, "is understanding that every part has to work together. If one component fails, the whole structure can collapse. But if you design it right, if you test every connection and plan for every stress point, the bridge can last forever." Harvey watched his daughter with pride, recognizing his own engineering philosophy expressed in her words. But more than that, he saw resilience, the ability to build something beautiful and strong even when the foundation had been shaken. After the presentation, Sarah ran to her father with the first-place ribbon. "Dad, we won. The judges said my bridge was the most innovative design they'd seen in years. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. You did incredible work." As they walked to the car, Sarah looked up at her father with the serious expression she'd inherited from both parents. "Dad, do you miss Mom?" Harvey considered the question carefully. "I miss the person I thought she